learning about the Trail of Tears this week. Can anybody raise their hand and tell me what they know about the Trail of Tears?
It was people that fight army and and slavery, and they had to do court, and it was a deadly march.
It was a deadly march, okay, and it was with the Cherokee Indians, and they were coming to the Cherokee land, okay? So today we're going to watch a quick brain pop video. So is everybody ready?
Yes, ma'am.
Dear Tim and Moby, can you tell me about the Trail of Tears? From Brandon. Yeah, we're on part of it now. But the Trail of Tears isn't a single route or a geographical name. It refers to the forced relocation of American Indian tribes during the 1830s. The United States government kicked more than 60,000 Indians off their ancestral lands and made them march nearly 1,300 miles west. Yeah, it's definitely not one of America's proudest moments. At the time, parts of the southeastern United States were still legally controlled by 5 major tribes: the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole. Together, they were known as the 5 civilized tribes. Right, as if other tribes weren't civilized or something? Well, white Americans considered the 5 tribes civilized because they were fairly peaceful and adopted some of the customs of their white neighbors. They dressed in European-style clothes, they built roads, schools, and farms, and many converted to Christianity. The Cherokee even published a newspaper and formed a government with a constitution modeled after the U.S. Constitution. But none of it could stop the waves of white settlers who were hungry for more and more land. In 1803, the United States bought a huge amount of land from France in the Louisiana Purchase. With all this new territory, some Americans saw an opportunity to take over Indian lands in eastern states like Georgia and Tennessee. They just needed to convince the tribes living there to move out west. When gold was discovered on Cherokee land in 1828, white settlers demanded that the government do something about the Indians. So, in 1830, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act. Signed by President Andrew Jackson, the act authorized the government to negotiate land treaties with American Indian tribes. In theory, tribes would voluntarily give up their lands in exchange for money and new lands west of the Mississippi River. Right, in reality, it wasn't voluntary at all. Tribal leaders were pretty much forced into signing unfair treaties. The Choctaw were the first to leave in 1831, followed by the Creek in 1834, the Chickasaw in 1837, and the Cherokee in 1838. As for the Seminoles, a large group of them decided to hold their ground, and they ended up fighting a 10-year war with the U.S. Army. Eventually, though, most were forced out west onto Indian lands in 1842. Well, it was a Choctaw chief who first described the removal of his people as a trail of tears and death to a newspaper reporter. But it was the Cherokee removal that popularized the term. The law-abiding Cherokee tried to fight the government by going to court, with 2 cases went all the way to the Supreme Court. The court eventually ruled in their favor, but by that time, it didn't matter. In 1835, a small group of Cherokee went against the wishes of the rest of the tribe and negotiated the Treaty of New Echota. It sold all existing Cherokee lands for $5 million and promised that the tribe would move west to Indian Territory. Most Cherokee were furious, but there was nothing they could do. 3 years later, President Martin Van Buren ordered the army to enforce the treaty. On May 17, 1838, 7,000 troops went to Georgia to round up the Cherokee for the long journey west. Men, women, and children were driven from their homes at gunpoint and crammed into temporary camps in Tennessee and Alabama. Even before the journey began, many people in the camps died from disease and starvation. Of the survivors, a few thousand were loaded onto steamboats and barges to make the journey by river. The rest went on foot, marching over 1,100 miles to what's now Oklahoma. Exposure, starvation, and diseases like pneumonia and smallpox caused many deaths. Cherokee leader John Ross convinced the army to split up his people into smaller groups so they could follow different routes and forage for food more easily. Ross's heroic efforts saved many lives. But by the time the last groups reached their new home in 1839, close to 1/3 the 15,000 Cherokee had died in the camps or on the trail. The Cherokee term for the removal translates to the trail where they cried, and that's how this entire era came to be known as the Trail of Tears. Thankfully, the Cherokee and other tribes were able to survive and preserve their history and cultural identity to this day. And in 1987, Congress created the Trail of Tears National Historic Trail, stretching through parts of 9 states to commemorate the tragic removal. It's okay to be sad. We need to remember the suffering of these Americans, not just to honor their memory, but to make sure that we learn from the mistakes of the past. Okay, let's get going.
Alright, so as we know, about 1/3 died on the adventure out to the Cherokee lands, okay, the Indian lands. They died from what? What was some of the things they passed away from? Diseases, starvation, they were cold, okay? So some traveled by foot, they had to cross water, all right? There was a treaty signed, it went to the Supreme Court. So those are all things that you need to take into consideration, okay? There was a march. So right now, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna break you into 3 small groups, all right? And you're going to go in your groups, and what you're gonna do is on your table, you have a book, The Trail of Tears, each of you. I've marked key pages in here that may be useful. You have pencils and you have a poster. Your group is going to illustrate some details of the event of the Trail of Tears, okay? So you can include the march, you can include them marching through the water, you can include some that may be sick with the lack of food, you can sign the treaty, you can show the treaty, the president signing the treaty, you could draw the courtroom, anything of that nature, okay? So I want you to do an illustration. I also want you to use word boxes, okay? Include some words, like 1/3 maybe passed away. When did this all start? The early 1800s, okay? And you've got about 10 minutes, so I need you to work quickly on this, okay? And then I'm gonna pick a group to present it to the class, okay? So on the count of 3, we're gonna divide up group 1, group 2, and group 3, all right? 1, 2, 3. If you have any questions, I will be walking around to monitor you. Your interpretation of the Trail of Tears, okay? It's okay. You can't be wrong. No, I'm sure. Seeing some really good drawings on these posters, illustrations of your interpretation of the Trail of Tears. Good job. I like how everyone is working together and talking quietly. Okay, what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna stop you right there. And I want the groups to come back to the carpet with your poster. And it's okay if you didn't finish at the end, maybe we can have a little bit of time to break back in the groups and finish. So if your groups will come back and come to the carpet quickly. Your crisscross applesauce